When you're trying to learn to draw your own style, to create your own characters, your own world with a unique look, it's tricky to know how much perspective, how much rendering, how much anatomy, how much of all these foundational concepts do you need to learn. One thing you can always count on 100% of the time is that proportion is going to help you out. Proportion is actually at the core of most drawing. And what we're going to do in this video is look at how learning proportion can really help your stylized characters, no matter how stylized they are. For instance, one of the things that we often are challenged with when you're learning realistic anatomy is trying to figure out how to make it more interesting. How do you exaggerate it? But then how do you make your stylized characters look consistent time and time again? This all comes down to proportion and understanding how to plan out your drawings. So what we're going to do is draw a bunch of different character faces and look at how proportion plays into different levels of stylization and how you can use this simple concept to enhance all of your drawing. Hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. Okay. So we all know that proportion is pretty important for drawing. If you look at most drawing books, a lot of what we're going to be doing there, and these are from some of the Andrew Loomis drawing books, Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, Drawing the Head and Hands, you're going to see a pretty good breakdown of proportion. And this is what we're talking about. But often I think when you look at these examples, if you want to draw something that is more stylized, which I did when I was growing up, I wanted to draw things like Asterix or Tintin, things that were much more stylized, things like the Dragon Ball manga that I saw, things like all of the cartoons that I saw, and it was non-obvious how this was going to help me. I think that is the biggest challenge here. And it feels like getting accurate proportion is something that is kind of reserved for realistic drawing. But the reality is that proportion is what underlies everything. Even when you see people drawing from life, a lot of what they're doing when you do that thing where you kind of hold up your pen to kind of look at what something is this way versus that way, really what you're doing is just gauging proportion. And a lot of what messes us up when we're initially drawing is our inability to understand proportion. Let's look at this from the perspective of a simple face though, because that's probably the easiest way to really kind of understand how this would work. And what I'll do is just outline how we can think about some of the primary proportions of the face, and then how we can modify that to get interesting looks. And I'll also talk about a little bit how this can relate to very, very stylized characters. And we're just going to be dealing with this as it relates to faces, but everything is very similar. So if I look at drawing a character, and this is pretty faint here, but this is often how we start out drawing some of this rough proportion. What I'm going to be doing if I'm creating a character that's somewhat realistic is trying to break down the proportions of the face. So if we follow that Loomis method, or your typical constructive anatomy, what we're going to find is that the key proportions are this first proportion of the head, that is the top of the brow to the hairline, or where the hairline would be. And then what we're doing is duplicating that down, and that really is going to be where the bottom of the nose lies. And then all we do to get to the bottom of the chin is just duplicate that proportion again, and then we get here. And so roughly speaking, everyone's going to be a little bit different, and this is where creating exaggeration or stylization can be really important. So if I just follow this basic plan and we think about creating a simple rough, typical quote-unquote character head, that's what we're going to find. Now, the reality is, though, this will apply to absolutely everything. Any manga style you want to use, insofar as you want to add dimensionality to any part of it, you can think about these basic proportions and all the other proportions of the face. For instance, we're going to find in normal anatomy that the ear is going to line up with that third proportion below or lining up with the eye and the bottom of the nose. And the ear's going to be, look, somewhere in there. It can move around a little bit. All these things are fluid. Everyone is different. That's what makes people interesting. But this is often what we're dealing with. And likewise, we can think about some other simple proportion markers for things like the eyes. And just trying to understand where do those eyes go in relation to the other body parts. So for instance, if we sort of take the width of the nose and then we draw a line up the face, that's where our sort of tear duct is going to be. And then we also know that there's probably one eye width between these two eyes and half an eye width right on the side. So what you'll notice, though, is like maybe you want to create a character that has much bigger eyes. Maybe you want to create a character that has a much bigger nose. And so what we do, if we're thinking about that and saying, okay, let's look at this from a couple of different perspectives. If I just want to say, let's create a character with a different size of some feature, because this is often what we want to do. We're stylizing, we're characterizing. So I've still got those three proportions. I've got hairline to where the eye would be. And then I'm going to duplicate that proportion down. And I'm just doing that by eye, right? Kind of saying, well, this distance looks very similar to this distance. Let's swap to a darker pencil so we can see that a little bit easier now. And this is kind of roughly where the nose would go. Somewhere there. And then I duplicate that proportion down again and say, look, this is probably where the chin is going to end. And then you can think about additional proportional things. And the more of these you learn, this really is the trick, is a lot of drawing, especially from your imagination, is a matter of remembering these proportions. And one of the best exercises that you can do that's an abstract exercise, i.e. something that's a fake drawing exercise, it's got nothing to do with you sort of really learning to draw the characters you want or in the style you want, is just to memorize some of those basic proportions and keep repeating them. That really is where a lot of these anatomy books are useful, is so we just kind of drill those little proportional markers and then you just kind of remember them. For instance, the jaw is likely to change direction somewhere in line with the mouth, right? So if I sort of divide that bottom proportion here in half, in many cases, the jaw is going to change direction at that point. And again, that's where the actual bone of the jaw is, but you still have some flesh underneath the chin. And the back of that neck, right, where the sort of skull ends, if you look at your sort of typical skull, if we look at our typical skull proportion, what we're going to find is that the skull actually, probably sort of ends at the bottom of that nose, somewhere along there, a little bit below. So the skull itself, back of the head goes there. And there's obviously a fair amount of sort of skin towards the back, but that's often what we're looking at. And all I say is, hey, if I want to change some of these, I can just change the proportion. And I can either say, well, let's keep the character feeling realistic, but let's push it to the nth degree. Let's play around with shape. Let's play around with character. And although I'm not changing the overall proportion of the character's face, like this still feels realistic, right? It would still overlap with a basic skull. What I am doing is really pushing some of the characterization of the features as far as they will go. And what you'll find is that I can create really interesting, exaggerated, stylized characters using this method just by pushing and pulling these simple features. And this is often, I think, one of the challenges that we face early on is you kind of think, hey, I want to create something interesting. This Loomis thing is like crushingly boring, right? It's just so boring and banal. And I find, like, what I found is I drew so many of these Loomis heads when I was practicing, and I feel like after you've drawn a few, like, they just got worse and worse and worse, and they looked more and more boring. And I was like, what's the point, right? Like, I kind of get it. Yeah, once you sort of get the basic proportions, we often imagine, though, that in order to get stuff to look interesting, we need to kind of really stylize it. And the reality is often just making very subtle changes in anatomical proportion and facial proportion will make a huge difference. For instance, if you look at the way people are built, you know, if people have slightly wider shoulders, slightly longer arms, they're going to look really different. And just the subtle way that some people might have different body shapes and different proportions, and you're talking like very small in terms of the measurements, but it just makes a huge difference in terms of what we're looking at and the way it feels. So because we're so fine-tuned to looking at facial structure, any little tweak I make to this, right? If we has some sort of Street Fighter, I've been drawing a lot of Street Fighter on the channel recently. You know, if you have those kind of crazy Capcom style eyebrows, right? Like, we're making very small proportional changes, but all of a sudden this feels like a caricature. Almost, and if you push it far enough, like, you can create a whole world with characters that feel anatomically accurate. They feel realistic, but they feel like the best character actors. You know, like when you know, like, a really, really good character actor who just has a really interesting face. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. And so that's the first thing I'd say is, like, if you're after something that's realistic, but you want to add more style and interest and impact to your work, it really is just a matter of sticking with these basic boring proportions and then just adding a little bit, right? Like, adding a little bit. Like, you know, even if you just play with the proportions of the ear and say, okay, like, these ears are like this. You know, some people are going to have ears that really kind of pop out. You know, they're going to be rounder. This will really change the look and feel of the character, versus if you have ears that are a little bit more elven, right? They're a little bit more like this. This is still within the realms of realism. But all we're doing is I'm just consciously changing the proportion. Now, why is this important? Why is this like a critical thing? Because if you're drawing and designing things and you're actually interested in creating a interesting world or redrawing characters or making them consistent, is you need to kind of understand what are the basic proportions and how am I deviating, and how does this character that I'm drawing consistently deviate. So what I would do in the beginning is I would just draw all these kind of really interesting characters, and I draw them with these weird features exactly like this, but you know, I wouldn't always be able to repeat it. So that's something to keep in mind. Though, if we want to look at how this applies to even more stylized characters, again, you could look at how this would help you create an anime or sort of manga style character. I'll just demonstrate this really quickly using one of the characters that I draw for Star Atlas Core comic, because I know it well, who has gigantic eyes. So if we look at one of the characters from Star Atlas Core, and this is really going to underline the point of this, is that if you just modify these proportions, so this won't look like a manga or anime style, but it will kind of look as if it's got my style with a couple of key features. So I'm starting with the same thing, which is like I'm defining a skull, I'm defining a center line, I'm defining the brow ridges. These are key markers of the face, and I'm still going to define that basic proportion, right? I've got 1, right, 2, and then we sort of got 3, except, and I'll actually just create this with the standard proportion, and then I'll talk about how, in a minute, how stylization that you create can pervade every character that you draw. So this is Moda from Star Atlas Core, and Moda is a Maurice. And a Maurice is an alien, and they have these tentacle head tails. And they have a couple of other key features, such as having gigantic eyes. So the way I often start Moda when I'm drawing him, as I do all the time at the moment, I'm drawing these characters all day, literally all day, every day. So this is, what I sort of do for my main sort of job at the moment, as opposed, and in addition to sort of YouTube and stuff, is I just draw faces like this all day. And this is how I do it. This is what I'm doing. So there's a couple of key things that I'm doing there. I'm elongating the chin, and you could elongate this a little bit or a lot, but for Moda, he kind of has a really long face. But I'll just keep him a little bit more simple for now. So all I do is I kind of say, well, he has these gigantic eyes. So I'm starting with that same base as I would start everyone else, except now all I'm doing is just increasing the size of the eyes right to the edge of where those cheekbones are. So I've got my center line, right? I'm making sure these line up, because a lot of proportion is understanding how to transfer proportion from side to side, probably the topic for another video. But this is kind of what happens. And the other thing is I then create and construct this mound that he kind of has in the center of his forehead. And this is my simplification of the in-game characters for the Stylist world, a lot of which were designed by the amazingly young and skilled Zhao Lira. So what I'm doing is basically just saying, in order to draw Moda, I need to make his eyes like basically just huge, like as big as they physically can be. And once I've got that proportion, then really what I'm doing is trying to wrap around those cheekbones and see whether I can make it feel as if those eye sockets would kind of exist. But he's kind of literally, I guess, like that big-eyed gray alien sort of vibe. Has normal-ish kind of human mouth, and then the Maurice have these weird, or at least the comic version that I created, have these weird little kind of things that come out, and they often have sort of body mods, right? So Moda has some kind of implants and either sort of scarring tissue or just extra kind of alien marks here. And so that's basically, how I would sort of define that. I'm starting with the same thing. I'm just modifying the proportions of the eyes. And obviously from a structural standpoint, I can find center. Boom. Right, he has this gigantic head tail, and all I'm doing is finding the proportion. I'm finding where that sort of temple would be. And the other thing, and then again, all these sort of head tentacles that come off. Has another kind of stick that kind of comes out there. And that's the basic sort of structure. The other thing is, and even though the Maurice have like different eyes in the in-game thing, I just do these little sort of dot eyes because that's what sort of works for me. The other thing that we have is ears that actually come up quite a bit, so that they're a little bit sort of elfish. They don't have lobes in the same way. And I think actually the in-game ones don't have any of that sort of normal structure. But this is kind of what I did for the comic version that's simplified. Right, so what this does is allows me to basically draw this character again and again and again. And the Maurice do also have quite long sort of necks as well. And so it's just that persistent characterization, persistent modifying of that proportion that allows me to draw that character again and again and again. And so what I'm doing as I'm doing this is I'm memorizing proportions of the character. Have a little spacesuity thing on. Boom, there we go. And what this, I guess, is trying to demonstrate here is that a lot of the choices and the things you're going to do when it comes to drawing, let's look at this from front on here so you can kind of see the frame. Again, this look kind of changes the proportions a little bit, so I thought I'd kind of show you this. Yeah. So all we're doing to create more stylized characters, or characters that feel as if they are sort of alien, or different sort of races or anything like that, which is often, again, that's kind of what I wanted to do. And I'd look at my sort of Loomis book and be like, but this looks really boring, and I'm just kind of trying to restrain myself. But proportion is just remembering the relative size of one thing to another. So lastly, just quickly, let's see if we can look at how I would apply this to a style overall. So let's see if I can move these up. And what I'll do is switch back here so I can kind of see me drawing it. And I'll just sort of explain how, if you're wanting to develop a style that's unique, you can sort of modify this. So obviously, a more manga sort of anime style is going to just have slightly different base structure and probably kind of bigger eyes, but not always. If you look at sort of Katsuhiro Otomo, director of Akira or something like that, has a very sort of standardized, sort of less kind of big eye manga look. And there's so many different manga examples, but definitely if you want to draw like sort of Dragon Ball or Naruto or something like that, you're going to want sort of bigger eyes as a base. But if I sort of look at the style that I normally have, I'll draw Jion, who is the main sort of human character from Stylist Core. And again, I'm drawing the sphere, right? I'm defining the side of it. I'm defining the brow. I'm defining the cheekbones. And what I do with this is I really just make the nose a little bit smaller. So with the style that I'm normally working with, and sometimes I get this wrong, and it's like way too small. But normally what I'm doing is I just elongate this space. And this is actually a very common stylization. And what I'll sort of talk about here is why I think that's really important. A lot of the time when we're thinking about style, like manga big eyes or anime big eyes or whatever it is, we're kind of thinking that this is just arbitrary. But having really big eyes means that when the character is very small, you can still see what they feel. So even if mode is really small like this, I can still read the eyes, can still read the expression. And even though I don't often do that for the eyes of the character, by decreasing the nose, like the nose isn't actually that expressive. It doesn't, like it does. Having flared nostrils is one of those things where like a long time ago, I'd always be trying to draw characters that were angry, and I just couldn't figure out why they didn't look angry. And it's because of the nostrils, right? Like if you want to make someone look really angry, you've got to kind of make the nostrils bigger. Otherwise it doesn't work. But in general, what you're going to find is that if you give yourself more room to experiment and play with the mouth, right, it allows me to be a little bit more experimental and expressive with the mouth, and that's the same with the eyes. So if I have more of a defined, like realistic anatomical structure, right, as I start to make like if I was to make like a really big mouth shape, it's kind of it starts to like hit the nose, it starts to get confusing, and the structure of it kind of starts to break down. Whereas if you give yourself a little bit more room to play with some of those proportions, it often means that you can be more expressive with the eyes, right? Like, and this is the case, if I give myself more room here to play with the eyes for a character like Jion, it allows me to make them go bigger, smaller. Like, they can be really expressive. It's really easy to kind of see them. It's a lot easier to draw them. I think that's often why you have, again, larger eyes, smaller nose, typical kind of stylistic affectations. And well, I think that kind of works pretty well. But this is normally what I'm doing is, so I'm still going to make the jaw change direction where the mouth is, but it changes direction a little bit down lower. Let's look at this over here so you can see the exact proportion, because looking at it on the tablet does change that a little bit. But yeah, that's the this is the basic idea. So that's your typical, at the moment, the sort of styleless core or sort of Tim McBurney standard human stylization. Looks a little bit more stylized, right? I still keep the ear up here, but yeah, for a lot of these characters, you know, I just sort of exaggerate some of those features. And some of the characters may have like a much more exaggerated forehead or whatever, but I'm just allowing myself to play with those proportions a lot more. Now, one of the things that we often get challenged with is, like, how do I create my unique style? Like, how do I create a style that's actually unique to me? So Jiyoung kind of has this hair, right, that would sort of go. And he also has eyebrows, obviously. Right. And again, I'm exaggerating this a bit. Like, this is a pretty big sort of jaw, but just as an example. Right. Boom. Boom. All right. So what I would normally do then, if you want to make other characters look the same but different, if I was then taking that same standard stylization and saying, well, like, everyone in this world kind of has a little bit of a larger bottom proportion, I just do the same thing for the motor character. And the advantage of thinking about these proportions is that the quicker you get at it, right? So the nose is like even smaller. Is that the quicker you get at it, the easier it becomes to kind of just rough in those basic proportions. And what you'll find is once you kind of get the proportions right, everything else becomes a lot easier. Right, so once I've sort of roughed in those basic marks and kind of found where that is, everything else is a lot easier. Again, let's find the mound of that hair on top. Right. Boom. So again, it's mostly roughed in, and because I have like a pretty good way of figuring out the structure of the eyes, again, what I know is that the eyes kind of just take up all of that space. So I can still use my standard proportion to block it in. Right, and then I'm just making sure that the cheekbones kind of wrap around. And now we're going to have something that proportionally looks a little bit more like the motor from Styleless Core. And all I'm doing there is, as I said, just changing that one proportion and overlaying in what we would get from increasing the bottom jaw. So hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas of how you can sort of modify this, how you can push it and make it your own. And once you kind of got that baseline there, yeah, it's a lot easier to play around with some of those expressions. Right. And you can sort of build it from there. And again, that's like the initial kind of block in, right? This is sort of the rough construction drawing. And then what I'll go through is, obviously there'll be an inking pass because this is a comic book project, but also I'm often going to be just going through tweaking, right? Like now that I got proportion, now I can think about some of that line work, right? I can actually make sure that, you know, these proportions kind of work. I can refine some of that secondary form. Yeah, we can really sort of go through it. So those are some basic tips on how, if you're interested in stylization, you can, you know, use these same ideas. One last little sort of bonus demo is, you know, when I was drawing my Pinocchio comic, completely different style, completely different vibe, completely different thing. again, we still got a sphere, but what I did is obviously still I'm going to define the dimensionality of the sphere, right? And here's the kind of halfway, but Pinocchio's face actually existed down here, almost in this kind of bottom quarter, right? If we think about, I would sort of think about dividing that up, and then I'd say, yeah, Pinocchio's nose and then kind of lives here, right? And his eye would kind of live on that bottom line. And this just gave him a really cute kind of look. And then the ear would always kind of come up here, but be just an extension of that sort of bottom line. And then he'd have his little kind of cap, right, which is just a simplification of these lines, right? And that is how I can still draw the same character, you know, any day of the week. You just be like, draw Pinocchio. I'm like, okay, done that before about 1,000 times. So we can always do it again. So most drawing, even if you're drawing realistically, it is about understanding proportion and understanding how to break down the proportion, memorize the proportion, see the proportion in front of you, see the positive space, negative space, memorize how these things go. And that's why, even if you want to draw cool stylized stuff in a semi-realistic manner to push reality, make it as if your world's always just full of the most interesting faces possible, or whether you want to create something that is, you know, a little bit more realistic, but, you know, has a definitive style, or learn how to create weird alien creatures, or draw manga or anime or whatever style you want. These things are really good, but the goal here is just to give you something really simple to practice. Like, so many people understand and know the basic proportions of your sort of boring, typical, standard, you know, sort of Western style head from, again, it's from the 50s or 60s, 40s, whatever it is. Yeah, you know, and this gives you a really good baseline. But don't get stuck on this, right? Like, think about memorizing those proportions, playing around with them, and as soon as you kind of want to make it more interesting, make it more interesting. If you want to see how we would render one of these up and add a little bit more rendering and shading, etc., especially if you want to do that with a simple tool set, check out this video where I draw Ryu from Street Fighter using the simple round brush in Photoshop.